What's up, everybody? Welcome to another episode of the Junkyard Dawgcast. I'm your host, Jordan Hill. Got Ben Wolk with me on this episode. Make sure and subscribe there on YouTube at Dogs 24/7. A action-packed episode of the Junkyard Dawgcast tonight. We're going to talk about what we saw in the 15 minutes of practice we got to see on Thursday as part of Georgia's second practice of the spring. We're going to talk about Pro Day. On Wednesday, who stood out among the Bulldogs getting ready for the 2025 NFL Draft. And we will close things out by talking about Georgia basketball. A disappointing run at the SEC tournament, but things are still looking up for Mike White and company as they get ready for the NCAA tournament. So we'll get it going. Make sure and subscribe to the YouTube, and let's get this thing rolling. Welcome back to another episode of the Junkyard Dawgcast. I'm your host, Jordan Hill. Got Ben Wolk with me on this Thursday night. A lot to get into and a lot to talk about with the Georgia Bulldogs. We had a chance to go out and watch about 15 minutes of Georgia's second practice of the spring. We're going to get into that. We're going to talk about Pro Day. Ben was on hand for that on Wednesday as several Bulldogs tried to show out in front of NFL brass, and sure sounds like quite a few of them succeeded in that endeavor. And then we'll close things out talking about UJ hoops. One and done in the SEC tournament, not exactly what they had in mind, but still sitting pretty when it comes to the NCAA tournament. And we'll know the field on Sunday, and we'll get into that as well. So, Ben, let's kick it off with sort of the main event. We had a chance to watch some practice on Tuesday. About 15 minutes worth as Georgia had its second of 15 practices. And I'm going to set you up first. I want you to talk about, what stood out to you, what kind of caught your attention. You were sort of in photographer mode. You did a great job with the gallery that's up over at Dogs247.com. But what caught your attention? What stood out to you on Thursday?
Well, as you probably feel sort of the same way, but as you can see from the photo gallery as well, like anytime you're out at the first spring practice of the year, I think everyone's eyes gravitate towards people that you've never seen in a Georgia football jersey before. So, I'm watching the wide receivers, Zachariah Branch, Noah Thomas, CJ Wiley, Talon Taylor, Tyler Williams, Landon Roldan. Like, you can see the overhaul at the wide receiver position just by how many new faces and new jersey numbers and new looks you're getting just at that position. I mean, you can do the same thing when you go to the defensive side of the ball when you're running through some of those freshmen. I mean, Isaiah Gibson stands out to you. Elijah Griffin stands out to you. At defensive back, you've got three new safeties, Zion Branch, Jaden Harris, Adrian Maddox. Like, there's just so many new faces at key positions that is 100% where I went first, just because, what does Zachariah Branch look like in a Georgia jersey? I mean, we were sitting there after the practice in the media room and I was going through the photos, and every time I'd get to a photo of Zachariah Branch, I'd just say, man, I can't believe Zachariah Branch is at Georgia right now. Like, it really hits you for the first time when we get that access to this practice, and you recognize, like, man, this is a new look roster. We're only barely 2 months removed from Georgia's last football game, and it feels like an entirely different football team in many respects. So that's where I gravitated to at first. Obviously my recruiting background had me intrigued by seeing Jared Curtis out there with Mike Bobo, some other quarterbacks, some other defensive backs, some offensive linemen that were there on visits as well. Like, that stuff always sticks out to me, but I know that the people I get 5 questions a day. What do I think is going to happen with Jared Curtis? What I think is going to happen with Jared Curtis? And until he actually makes that decision, well, really until he gets done with these visits that he's been on, it's impossible for me to say. But I found it interesting that he was out there mingling about, hanging out with Mike Bobo during practice a little bit as well. He's definitely very comfortable out there. I mean, from an actual football breakdown perspective, it's hard to have too many takeaways. Like I think we got 14 minutes. Like we didn't get a whole lot. So a lot of it is roll call. What do some of these new guys look like in Georgia jerseys? As an example, like Juan Gaston, you see him, and like I've seen him at the high school level, and it doesn't take a rocket scientist to know what 6'7", 380, that's a big dude. But when you actually see that next to the Jaw Jacksons of the world, and you see that next to the Monroe Freelings and the Bo Hewleys, it makes you really say, like, man, this guy's a freshman, but this guy is built like some of these big time, big body Georgia offensive linemen that they've had. So that's always my biggest takeaway from that first practice. I mean, I know I was pissed at myself for not getting as good of a photo as Elijah Griffin as I would have liked to, just because there's a lot going on. But you see Elijah Griffin in his pads, and you're just like, man, he looks the part out there. So I don't know about you, but that's really the first thing that I do anytime that I get out to that first spring practice.
100%. You're looking for the transfers. You're looking for the freshmen. You mentioned Elijah Griffin. Thought Isaiah Gibson at outside linebacker really stands out physically. Even too, just kind of looking at not even necessarily newcomers, but other people that you're kind of watching closely. Quintavious Johnson, he was one of the first outside linebackers up. I think he's got a chance to have a big impact during the spring. Going through them, watching the DBs and seeing what they were doing. Honestly, didn't really get to watch Zachariah Branch with the receivers like I wanted to. It's sort of a product of when you do this. And shout out to the Junkyard, when I posted, hey, we're going to have a viewing period. What do y'all want to see? It was offensive line, defensive line, secondary. So I really tried to focus there. And, next time we go out, I'll really try to sit and watch the receivers because I've heard really good things about Zachariah Branch to this point. And the biggest thing for me, Ben, it's just such a fun time of year. And we're at spring practice is definitely timed really well this year where, it felt great to be out there. I know we're not out there for very long, but you're starting to see new faces. You're trying to keep an eye on the position coaches, who they're working closely with, who's getting attention. It's an exciting time of year, and spring's one of those things where there are position battles going on, and maybe there are some situations guys will lock down by the time spring's over. But for the most part, in spring ball, it's just trying to get better, to grind, and a lot of the time you see those competitions carry into fall camp. But it's just a fun time of year, and it was just fun for me being back out there, and fingers crossed maybe we'll be out there again before too long.
Yeah, I love it. And it was a beautiful day out there. The lighting was great for photos. Like it just felt like a spring football practice. I will also add one other thing too that I found interesting. Ryan Montgomery, he's bouncing back from that ACL injury. I know you saw him getting some work in the indoor facility, and then he was working with the wide receivers outside as well, throwing with them less so than working directly with the quarterbacks. But for a guy that's bouncing back from an injury, just nice to see him actually out there in a jersey, getting some throws in, getting some work in.
Yeah, you want him to be back sooner rather than later. I believe that was August when he tore his ACL. So that was a good sign. And a couple other guys, I'll just note that, we only got to see individual drills, so we don't really know how active they are when you got good on good, when you got, some of the first team versus first team, that sort of stuff. Dalen Everett was working with the cornerbacks. He's been dealing with a sports hernia. You look to Joseph Jonah Ajanye, who had that foot surgery back in October. He was one of the first defensive linemen up alongside Jordan Hall, which I thought was really interesting. Noting too that there's guys like Gabe Harris who aren't available, but I think Joseph's got a real opportunity this spring, so that was good to see that there. I don't want to go into too much detail because I would like to reroute y'all back to dogs247.com. Had the practice report. I had the VIP observation story. Will say was really interested to kind of see the breakdown between the safeties and the star position, that nickel position. And as I kind of wrote about in my story, you can't make a big deal of that right now just because they're probably going to mix and match. They love to cross-train guys, but I will say some intrigue there. And then one thing we talked about on Tuesday's episode, Ben, did not see Will Muschamp. So it's a very interesting situation there. And I don't know that it's one we're going to really have an answer to anytime soon, but when you go out for practice for the first time in a spring setting, that very first practice kind of turns into attendance taking, and most of the time that's with players, but with Will, it was kind of let's see if he is around. So I found that very interesting. I did not see him out there on the field.
Yeah, and honestly, it's probably something that we're all going to be making too big of a deal out of now because of
Us.
No, we would never. But I mean, I will like. I don't even want to make a big deal out of it because I didn't even know that there was potentially something going on behind the scenes there, and I don't think it is a big deal. It's just the fact that Kirby Smart was asked about it, and then he almost like in a weird way, like Kirby doesn't do weird answers like that typically. Like when things are weird, he typically has a very well thought out response, and it was kind of just like, we'll deal with that in the future. And I realize the friendship that those two have is so close that he can probably say something like that, and it's just like, we'll deal with this in the future, and that's just the way that it is. But I know because he was asked about it, and because it is Will Muschamp, we're going to be getting questions about it forever.
All right, before we turn the page from this, Ben, I'll start since I'm posing the question, but I want you to give me one guy that really caught your attention again during that 15-minute period. The guy that I really liked, what little I got to see, was just KJ Bolden. I felt like just looking at him, he looked a lot bigger, which you would expect. I mean, he's had a full year in the Georgia program. Really excited to see what he does as a sophomore. I think he can be an All-American type of safety for Georgia. So who do you feel like really, if you had to pick one guy, really caught your attention?
Well, Noah Thomas looks good. I mean, that's not a news flash. Like, this is a really big physical wide receiver that has done it in the SEC before, so it shouldn't surprise you. But I mean, even in a room, I mean, standing over there, you got CJ Wiley, who also looks really good on the hoof, but you got a guy like Colby Young, sizable guy. But man, Noah Thomas just looks like a different type of body in that room. And speaking of different type of bodies, seeing Elias Williams, and I've seen Elias Williams up close and personal before at high school practices and things like that. But it just always changes your perspective when you see them at a Georgia football practice, because you know that Georgia has some of the biggest, most physical, most athletic guys in all of college football. And then when you see number 10, and Elias Williams just looks different than a lot of these other guys, like, you notice a difference between Elias Williams and a lot of other players. And so that stood out to me. I could say the same thing for Isaiah Gibson. I think we both said that, like, another guy that I've seen at the high school level that I'm not surprised that he looks good as a true freshman, early enrollee true freshman. But when you see him next to some other Georgia defensive linemen and edge rushers, and you say, man, this guy already looks college ready, it makes you understand why certain guys are 5 stars. Let's put it that way.
Before we talk about some other stuff, I do want to talk about this. We've done this in the past. Part of spring is seeing some of the jersey number changes, and I wrote about that in the practice report. Do want to shout out a couple, because I think Ben and I are both kind of big numbers guys. We think there's a science to this. 2 guys that I think are destined to do big things in 2025 purely because of the number changes. Gabe Harris going from 29, which I really like, to number 0. I mean, that if you're number 0, I'm going to go ahead and write you in at least second team All SEC. Like, that's the floor when you wear number 0 on defense. And then Jordan Thomas, a guy that's getting ready for his second year at Georgia, going from number 92 to number 97. And maybe that's just kind of riding off the coattails of what Warren Brinson did, but I'm a big fan of a defensive lineman, number 97. I think he's got a bright future ahead.
And I'll say I will have, this is a little teaser for Friday morning at Dogs 24/7. I will have just like a full breakdown of early enrollees, transfers, new high school guys, numbers, and then any notable number changes that are happening on the roster as well. I have to say from the beginning, Landon Roldan wearing 84, given all of the Ladd McConkey comparisons that he's going to get. And I'll even admit it, I've been the one that's pushed back on the Ladd McConkey comparisons because I think they're different enough players. But when I saw 84 going through the drills, I said, did they trot Ladd back out here for the first spring practice? Like, I couldn't believe it. I think it is a hilarious thing that he is wearing 84 for Georgia this year.
You just have to lean into it, and I appreciate they did it. That Georgia did it, that Landon did it, and I mean, let's see. That's some big shoes he's stepping into, so we'll see how he handles it. Ben, before we take a break, I do want to make sure and bring up some news from Thursday regarding Georgia's coaching staff. Our Matt Zenitz reporting that the Philadelphia Eagles are expected to hire Georgia assistant quarterbacks coach Montgomery Van Gorder. Montgomery's been a guy that's been mentioned a lot, even though he is not an on-field assistant for Georgia. What do you think of the news of Montgomery getting ready to leave Georgia? And then specifically, we mentioned Jared Curtis earlier in this episode. Do you feel like his impending departure will play a role at all as Jared Curtis gets ready to decide where he's going to college?
Well, and for people that don't follow recruiting in the weeds, sometimes you see moves like this and you don't necessarily recognize. I mean, I know in Montgomery's case, the last name Van Gorder holds some weight in football circles, so people are probably more familiar with him than some other, off the field staffers. But this is a guy, anytime that I have ever had conversations with quarterbacks, and we'll just talk about the ones that are Georgia related right now. I mean, I'd mentioned Ryan Montgomery. We saw Hezekiah Millender for the first time today. We've talked about Jared Curtis, who was out at the practice today. Every single one of these guys has mentioned Coach Gummy to me, and that's what all these players call Montgomery Van Gorder, Coach Gummy. And he is really a primary point of contact, if not the lead point of contact for many quarterback recruitments that Georgia's going through. I mean, Mike Bobo is obviously heavily involved. Kirby Smart is always going to be involved in quarterback recruitments, but Montgomery Van Gorder has been a key part of quarterback recruiting. Really, I mean, he's been on the staff since 2019, and he's really assumed into this type of role that he's in really since 2022 or so. So he's a key part of what Georgia does when it comes to quarterback recruiting. How it's going to impact, Jared Curtis's recruitment specifically, I don't think it's going to have a significant impact. Like, Jared Curtis is making his decision based on all the factors that quarterbacks are making decisions. What does the depth chart look like? What's the path to playing time? What have you done with quarterback development? What does my NIL package look like? Like, all the types of things that any quarterback is going to be looking at. If you are getting recruited as a 5-star quarterback, you know that your off the field assistant quarterback coach is likely trying to work his way up through the coaching ranks. Any coach that's an off the field staffer at Georgia that's getting a look at with an NFL team, not to mention the defending Super Bowl champions, like, that's going to be a step up that anybody is going to want to take. I will say the timing of this announcement is very strategic on Georgia's part. Like, this is not news. Georgia has known about this for several days now, and it's been communicated to the Curtises. They just wanted to get them on this visit where they could sit down and everybody talk about what is the sort of separation of quarterback power going to look like going forward. What does this mean now that Montgomery Van Gorder is gone? And so they wanted to have that conversation before it really broke publicly. And so because of that, like, I got some questions today, like, oh, the timing of this with Jared being on campus is really unfortunate. It's like, no, it's not. It was completely calculated by Georgia in terms of how this all unfolded. Great move for Montgomery Van Gorder. Super happy for him. Well-deserved. Anytime that I hear off the field staff members' names, and it's not just at quarterback, like, I hear it come up on the offensive line, Egmond Kogbilla, on the defensive line, Dayton LeBlanc. Like, you hear, I'm sure, the Coach Baugh, and I'm blanking on his full name because everyone that I talk to just refers to him as Coach Baugh, but at linebacker, the new assistant linebackers coach that came over, like, you hear these guys' names over and over and over again, and because they're not the on-field position coaches, they sometimes get a secondary thought from fans, but they play such a critical role in the day-to-day recruiting side of things. That said, Georgia will have a great replacement for Montgomery Van Gorder. There will be somebody new that will assume that role, that will now start being a primary contact for quarterbacks moving forward. And so, as is always the case with the Georgia organization, like, they will have the people to backfill it and make sure that those roles are satisfied. But no doubt about it, someone that has been a critical part over the last couple of years of Georgia quarterback recruiting will not be going forward. And so it'll be interesting to track, but I don't expect it to have any kind of, like, if Jared Curtis chooses Oregon over Georgia, it's not because Montgomery Van Gorder went to the Eagles while he was on his visit. That's just not the case at all.
Appreciate the person on our board who said, hey, look, Eagles, You can take our players. Let's lay off of the coaches. But no, I think people are excited for Montgomery. I think he is a rising star in this
Definitely.
business. This is not the last you've heard of Montgomery Van Gorder. All right, we're going to take a quick break, come back and talk about Pro Day and also talk about UGA hoops. All right, Ben, you and our Olivia Sayer were on hand for Pro Day on Wednesday. Got a chance to watch more than a dozen former Bulldogs as they get ready for the NFL draft in April. So tell us what stood out to you from Pro Day and if there were any dogs you felt like really helped their NFL stock and really impressed. Who would you say it was?
Well, I think most eyes, because Malachi Starks had already done most of what he was going to do at the NFL Combine. Obviously, he went through drills. Like, I don't think that there was as much focus or attention on Malachi yesterday as there has been, or some other guys. Jalen Walker was around, and anybody who's ever been around Jalen Walker, like, he has a magnetic personality about him. So it's not surprising to see that he's bumping elbows with all these NFL GMs and head coaches, and clearly has some great relationships that he established from the combine as well. But because he was not participating in any on-field drills and won't be doing anything until his private workout on April 17th, there wasn't a ton to take away with Jalen either. So I would say, I think most eyes were on two guys. And that's not to say that that's all that was going on. I have a couple other things that I would point to, but Michael Williams, he ran, he did a lot of the testing drills. He did a lot of the on-field workouts, and it was clear that when he was running his 40-yard dash, the place was silent and all attention was on Michael Williams. I don't know what NFL teams felt like he needed to run to solidify his stock. I think that the best unofficial I saw was like low 4.7 range, which I know, because of what Trayvon Walker or Nolan Smith from that position have done at times in NFL combines, people see 4.73 and they say, maybe left a little bit to be desired. But I think in Mikel's case, one, he carries a little bit more weight than those guys. I think that he plays inside and just slightly more position versatile than those guys have been throughout their careers, that nobody in the world was expecting him to go out and run a 4.4 the way that those guys did. And so for him, I think it was a matter of just proving that he can, move sufficiently. And I think a low 4.7 for a guy like Michael Williams at his weight with the film that he has put out there is more than enough. And I think for him, it was really just solidifying to these NFL teams, like, all right, I can do the straight line speed stuff. It's not going to be my wheelhouse. It's not going to be where I'm going to be strongest. It's not going to be the reason why I think that you should draft me, but I just want to put any of those questions to rest. And I feel like more or less he put those questions to rest. And I don't know exactly where he's going to fall in the first round, but I'm very confident that he will be a high draft pick for Georgia. And then the other guy was Dan Jackson. I mean, because and this was sort of the case for Chaz Chambliss and Ben Urosic as well, who, Chaz Chambliss I thought had a really strong day, but I know Ben Urosic testing wise really he probably made, there was a lot when Georgia had their combine snubs. I think everyone was talking about Chaz Chambliss and Dan Jackson. I brought it up. I was like, it's sort of weird with Ben Urosic, because at this time last year, you would have thought he probably would have been getting invited to the combine, and he was showing up in NFL mock drafts. And then for him to come to Georgia, get a little bit more exposure at a higher level, and then for him to not get that NFL combine look, it was sort of like not is he regretting his decision, but it's just a weird situation. You don't see it play out that way in the Georgia world. And I think that yesterday he maybe made people realize again, like, oh yeah, this is why Georgia liked him so much. And this is why he was playing as many snaps by the end of the season as Oscar Delp and Lawson Lucky was at times, because He does have some freakish athletic traits, and he does do some things at the time. He surprised me. Like, I don't even know what his specific 40-yard dash time was, but when he ran, I remember looking at whoever it was next to me and being like, man, he was really moving right there. And so it was that way with Ben Urosek and Chaz Chambliss as well. But just because of the dialogue that was around Dan Jackson, everyone wanted to know, Dan, what did you think about getting snubbed? How did you feel about the reaction that you got from getting snubbed? And typical Dan Jackson, he didn't care, or he wasn't going to let anyone believe that he cared at the very least. Like, he was just going to do what he can do. He feels like he's been snubbed his whole life. His college coach didn't even know who he was, really. So the fact that there's NFL teams that weren't getting to see him at the combine, big deal. That's just the next part of the Dan Jackson story. And for him to go run a 4.4, I mean, I was nearby KJ Bolden when he found out that Dan ran in the 4.4 range, and I don't know specifically what it was. I had heard like 4.38, 4.42, but somewhere around there. And I mean, KJ Bolden was just positively giddy when he heard the news, and he was joking around with some other guys. He was like, doesn't get invited to the combine, doesn't matter, still going to get drafted. And it's like, that's the Dan Jackson story. Like, I think, as I understand the backlash around him not getting invited to the combine, but I almost feel like this was the perfect encapsulation of the Dan Jackson story, where it's like, people don't really know who he is. People, you really got to get deep into the weeds of the film to understand Dan Jackson. And then he goes out and he runs a 4.4. I think he had a 10.3 broad jump. I was standing next to a Seahawks scout when he was doing the broad jump, and he was like, who do you think is going to have the best broad jump today? And I said, well, actually, I said Isaiah Reeves, who's the walk-on, because he just jumped 10.10. I was like, who the hell is this guy, and where's this 10.10 coming from? I didn't know a dang thing about him. But other than him, he was like, I was like, other than him, who do you think it's going to be? And the Seahawks scout looked and said, I think it's this guy right here. And so you could tell NFL teams got real interested when Dan was doing his broad jump. And I know that that's a testing measurement that NFL teams care about a lot, especially with their defensive backs. And so you could tell people were interested in what Dan was doing. I think that 10.3 caught a lot of people's attention. And, I don't know where he's going to get drafted, but I know that Dan Jackson has the film, the attitude, the experience, and now the testing proof to say that he can be a Sunday guy. And I think that that's going to be the case.
Yeah, I think he's going to be drafted. I think even going back to the Senior Bowl, I think that he helped his case quite a bit. And I'm glad that you brought up Urosic and also brought up Chaz Chambliss, because from what we've heard, it seemed like they did a really good job too. And the thing I wanted to point out too, like with the 40s and stuff, when you cover Georgia's Pro Day, they're not really advertising what these numbers are. It's usually scouts that are there getting the numbers. It's you kind of have to work or at least watch social media to get some of the measurements and the times. So I just wanted to point that out. All right, Georgia men's basketball minute. Been a long couple days. Ben was up in Nashville on Wednesday night. Thought I might have a stay in the Music City for a little bit longer than I did, but Georgia winds up losing in the opening round of the SEC tournament, 81-75 to Oklahoma. Georgia was the 11 seed in the tournament. Oklahoma was the 14 seed. Really strong performance on the whole for Georgia. The game just kind of took a turn with about 5 minutes left. Silas Demery Jr., who had another phenomenal game, 24 points. He gets his fourth foul. They pull him out of the game, which made sense. And then Oklahoma goes on a 16-0 run. And Oklahoma's offense was on fire this whole game. Hit 10 threes in the first half alone and hit several more in the second half. Jeremiah Fears, who had 2 points in that game back in January in Stegman Coliseum. I think he ended up with 29. I'd say a disappointing way for the tournament to play out. I think Georgia fans were hoping that they could make a little run, win a game, maybe upset Kentucky in the next round. But on the whole, I don't think anything to panic about. As Georgia gets ready for the NCAA tournament, I still think Georgia is in great shape to make the tournament for the first time in 10 years. I think it would take several bid stealers to really put Georgia on the ropes, but I don't see that happening. I think Georgia's going to make the tournament, although I will say I understand the frustration with Georgia falling short in the SEC tournament opener. Ben, what did you think of that Oklahoma game? Anything stand out to you as we now turn our attention to the NCAA tournament?
Yeah, I mean, to your point, it's disappointing in that, you finally put some good wins together and you want to win a game or two in the SEC tournament for pride's sake, probably as much as anything, maybe for seeding's sake in a certain respect. But I mean, my big takeaway is Jeremiah Fears was great. He was 8 for 16 from the 3-point line. When you're when you're out, when your best point guard is dealing with some foul trouble and the opposing guard is shooting 50% from three and lighting it up, like it's going to be a tough ask. Oklahoma was probably a better team this year in SEC play than their record indicated. So it probably feels a little bit worse that you lose to the team that finished, 14th or 15th in the SEC, as it was in the bracket rankings at least. But, I think it was a game Georgia could have won. I mean, I think about the 8 to 10 minute mark, I think Georgia had like a 3-4 point lead. They had a turnover, missed a couple shots, and then all of a sudden Arkansas is on a 15-0 run, 16-2 run, something like that. And those things can just get out of hand real quick. And fell into some of their earlier in the year stupid turnover situations. They had the one on the inbound, and then I think Silas just got kind of trapped on the baseline. He tries to get it out to Blue at half court and overshoots him, ends up being a backcourt violation. I felt like that play was kind of the nail in the coffin in the game, where it was like, if Georgia could have found a bucket there, they might have been able to find a way to win. And once they didn't, I just think that mathematically it was going to be too challenging. But I think you just take it on the chin. You don't let that be a game that affects your season or let it determine any future outcomes that you may have. I mean, to your point, I guess it could get a little bit dicey just depending on, are there some bid stealers? Do some of these bubble teams make runs during tournament week that make the committee change the way that they feel about them in comparison to Georgia? I don't see it playing out in a dangerous way for Georgia, but winning a game against Oklahoma would have removed any of that concern whatsoever. So now you just kind of sit around. If you're looking for silver linings, which me, I'm always going to try and my best to find the silver linings. Like, you get some rest. You played 4 straight games that you really felt like you had to win at the end of the season, and you won all 4 of them. That's going to take a lot of life out of you, a lot of energy out of you. And I think this was the first game that they've had where, I don't want to say they were feeling themselves, but they were probably not feeling like they were in a must-win situation for the first time in a few weeks. And so because of that, maybe they got a little bit too relaxed, or maybe Jeremiah Fears was just having a great game. Like, sometimes you do have to, and nobody likes to do this because everyone wants to complain, but like, sometimes you just have to tip your cap. Like, Jeremiah Fears was the best player on the court. And sometimes when you're the best, and that's not to say that if Georgia and Oklahoma played again tomorrow, that Silas wouldn't be the best player on the court or Asa Newell wouldn't be the best player on the court. But yesterday, Jeremiah Fears was the best player on the court. And as a result, the team with the best player on the court won. And sometimes that's just how it goes. Jeremiah Fears is going to have a 10-year NBA career. It's no shame that you got busted by Jeremiah Fears for a little bit. It's just, figure it out, get into the tournament. Hopefully you find, we were talking about this a little bit earlier today for, does Georgia win an NCAA tournament game or not? And I know we'll talk more about this over the next week or so, but like, I think it all just depends on the matchup. Like, there are certain things that Georgia does well that I think are going to give potential opponents a lot of challenges. At the same time, if you're a team that has a guy like Jeremiah Fears that can light it up, you might just be able to outscore a team like Georgia if Georgia's not hitting the shots the way that it did the last 4 games.
Yeah, I think when I look at Georgia going forward, I feel like this would be a very different situation as far as coming off this SEC tournament loss. If we're talking about a game where Silas Demery went like 3 of 14 from the field, I think I'd be a little bit more worried. He played great, 24 points. I think my biggest thing going into whoever they play in the NCAA tournament, they need one more scorer to step up behind Silas, Blue Cane, and Asa Newell, because I think that was kind of lacking in that game on Wednesday. Tyron Lawrence only had 5 points. Dakota LaFew didn't score at all. RJ Godfrey really struggled. Especially if you get some points down low along with Asa, I think that would go a long way. But I think this team's still in a good spot. I think that, again, we'll follow along on Sunday and probably have a podcast Sunday night once it's all settled and once we have talked to Mike White and the players if they did, in fact, make the NCAA tournament. But I think if you're a Georgia fan, you should feel good about this team. Tough to lose to Oklahoma, but they were playing really well. Before we get ready to close this thing out, Ben, with what's left of the SEC tournament, is there any particular team you're really interested in following? We're recording this minutes after Texas beat Texas A&M in double overtime. Is there a SEC team or two you just really want to watch closely with what's left of the conference tournament?
Well, I was curious. I didn't actually know that result on Texas A&M. So I was curious about Texas, Oklahoma, just because they're the ones that feel like they're still fighting for their tournament berths. And I guess if I'm Vanderbilt, I might be a little bit uneasy right now, just because they just lost to Georgia, they just lost to Texas. Texas is making a little bit of a run. Oklahoma has a win now in SEC tournament play. I'm not saying that Vanderbilt should be worried. It just, when Georgia and Vanderbilt were playing, it felt like Vanderbilt was safe and Georgia kind of needed to get that win to secure it. And now it kind of feels like Georgia's safe and Vanderbilt, like, I think they're safe, but it just, I don't know. It makes me sort of wonder. But at the top, I mean, you've got three teams, Florida, Alabama, and Tennessee, that I think can still earn first, number one seeds in the NCAA tournament. I think Auburn's going to be safe with their number one overall, or maybe not number one overall seed, maybe number one overall seed, but a one seed regardless. How that plays out with Georgia, Alabama, and Tennessee will be interesting. I think all three of those teams are good. In my opinion, I think Florida is the best of that group. Alabama's playing really good basketball right now, and then Tennessee just has crazy experience at the guard position. So it's maybe a lazy answer, but just saying, going to the top of the SEC, I'm really interested to see. I think whichever of those three teams, Alabama, Florida, or Tennessee, makes it the furthest this week, I think that team might punch that second SEC number one seed behind Auburn.
I'd say Oklahoma is the team I want to watch. I truly believe I'm going to predict it. They're going to beat Kentucky on Thursday night. I think that they've got the hot hand, and I think it's actually going to be to their advantage that they played on Wednesday. And then the other team, I'd probably just say Florida. I'll be honest, Ben, if they play well during this tournament, that might be who I pick to win the championship. They are prone to having off nights. But I really like that group at Florida. I think they have a chance to make some noise. And as much as Georgia fans don't want to hear that, if they do that, you still get to say that you beat them. And so, it's not all bad.
Yeah, I think they're my favorite to be my pick to win it all as well, just because, and I've said it on our board a bunch before, but like, they score 85 at will. And I mean, last year they lose in the NCAA tournament. I think they lost 102-100. So they were a team last year that was filling it up. They score 85 at will, and they're defensively, they have so much length. They're going to cause so many problems. Like, they were down 26 against Georgia. There's not many teams that can be trailing by 26 against Georgia and take the lead with a minute to go. Like, as much as that game was great for Georgia, it really was a testament to me of the nails that Florida team has, that they came all the way back the way that they did. And quite frankly, Walter Clayton did not play well against Georgia, and they still found a way to be able to do that. So they're a dangerous team. And yeah, this is a Georgia podcast, but you might not know it by the last minute and a half.
Yeah, we are a bunch of homers, just not for the team we cover. That should be your big takeaway. All right, Ben, final thing before we get out of here. There was a cover shoot leak for College Football 26, and Kirby Smart was a part of it. The leak included Kirby, Jeremiah Smith, Ryan Williams, Tim Tebow, Reggie Bush, Bryce Underwood, several other people. You can see the Oregon Duck, James Franklin. Initial thoughts on Kirby being on this cover. I'm still not convinced the cover we're seeing is legit because it kind of looks like crap, but I like, what they're going for here. What do you think about sort of getting the whole gang together for this cover, for the deluxe edition of the cover?
Well, based on the money that I've heard that this game has earned over the last year, I would like to think they had a better photo than the one that we're seeing. Like, I'm hoping that we are seeing like the most bare bones version of the photo or what they're planning to do with it. But cool. I do like the concept of it. Like, I mean, and the fact that, hey, you're flying out, it was in LA, you're flying out 4 or 5 head coaches, a bunch of these different players. Like, it's a cool concept, and it's a new world that we live in that you're able to do this. And I also my immediate thought is like, all right, Kirby Smart standing next to Ryan Williams, Jeremiah Smith. He's probably going to lose Noah Thomas after this year. Like, how many conversations is he having with these guys, while he's standing next to him? But a huge honor, obviously, for Kirby Smart. There's not many guys that are being asked to do that. And quite frankly, everyone else that, Arizona State makes sense because they're, sort of, you're filling a geographical need, and they were sort of a newcomer last year, and Kenny Dillingham, sort of a hot new name. And then, Ryan Day's won the national championship. And then you've got James Franklin, who won a couple of games, in the playoffs last year. It's like, Georgia's coming off a year. Yeah, they won the SEC, but they didn't win any college football playoff games. They didn't do anything special necessarily last year compared to previous years, but it just tells you where Georgia is in the sport, that like there wasn't a world that was going to go on where Georgia did not have some kind of representative on this cover. Did I see Harry Dogs on it, or that was in the photo shoot as well?
I was gonna say that I neglected to give Harry Dog a shout out. Yeah, he's over Kirby's shoulder, so shout out Harry Dog as well.
They probably wanted Harry on the cover, and they were just like, Kirby, we're gonna need someone to chaperone him out here, so you might as well join.
Yeah, no doubt. I do also think it's funny when last year's game was coming out, people were like, put Nick Saban on it. Let Nick be the cover because, he's the face of college football. And that didn't happen, but Kirby Smart gets on there. I am sure that that will have Alabama fans feeling really excited to buy this new game. All right, we're going to wrap up the episode there. I appreciate Ben for popping on. I appreciate everyone who watched this live, everyone who's watching or listening to it after the fact. Go to dogs247.com. Please subscribe. Busy time of year. Was in Nashville on Wednesday night, back in Athens to cover practice on Thursday. A lot of good notes in the observations and the practice report from Thursday afternoon. Really encourage you guys. Check that out. Ben's photo gallery as well. And we'll have more content. I know that Ben is working on the jersey numbers for Friday. That will be something y'all want to check out as well. Go to our YouTube, go to our TikTok. A lot of good content in the thick of Georgia football spring practice, Georgia basketball getting ready for the NCAA tournament, Georgia baseball getting ready for its first SEC series of the season with Kentucky. It's going to be a very exciting period of time, and we hope that y'all join us over on the Junkyard for it, because there's going to be a lot to talk about, a lot to write, and it's one of the great times of year. I can promise you that. So we'll wrap up the episode right there. For Ben Wolk, I'm Jordan Hill. Until next time, take care, everybody.